Hello and welcome to the India Briefing. This is Pragya Tiwari from New Delhi, and I'm joined by my co-host Mukulika Banerjee from London. Mukulika, I'm going to start by congratulating you. Mukulika has just delivered her inaugural lecture as the professor of social anthropology at the London School of Economics, and it was a resounding success. So I thought that for this episode, Mukulika and me are going to talk about some of the themes that she brought up in her lecture. These are themes that have been very central to her work, but they've also oddly been very central to my work and my thought as a journalist. This is something I've been writing about constantly, how democracy operates on the ground, how it manifests itself on the ground, what it really means on the ground. So this was the perfect occasion to kind of realign this conversation along the thought behind what democracy means today, particularly in a country like India. We are, of course, going to link the lecture for you in the show notes. But one of the reasons why I also thought that this might be an interesting conversation to get into is that so far we have 12 odd episodes. And in these episodes, we've mostly been talking about current affairs, about what's been really going on in India. This is an opportunity to kind of zoom out a little bit and to look at the lens through which we examine what is really going on in contemporary India and the world. So once again, Muku, congratulations. So proud of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Muku, I'm going to start by asking you about your framing device, if you will. When we talk of democracy, we think of it as a form of governance. We think of it as a given. Either you are a democratic country or you're not a democratic country. We sometimes measure democracy along a sliding scale about how democratic you are based on a couple of parameters. But you have spoken about the idea of democracy as something that has to be continuously cultivated. Cultivation is something that goes in cycles. It requires a certain kind of toil. It requires you to get your hands dirty. I want you to talk a little bit about this metaphor. Why did you choose this metaphor? What do you mean by this idea, and why you use this as sort of framing device for your lecture?
Thank you, Pragya. I think it's a metaphor that comes really out of doing fieldwork in rural India, where people are literally cultivating crops, right? And to think about what that process is and whether we can make it a metaphor to productively think about democracy. Just like you said, we think of it as a set of institutions, right? There's an institutional framework of democracy. There should be free and fair elections. There should be separation of powers. Should be a rule of law. There should be a free media, freedom of expression, etc. And we work with this sort of checklist, right? Does this country have these things? And if it does, then it's a democracy. And once you introduce these institutions into a context, which we saw very much in the post-Cold War period in Eastern Europe in particular, you wanted to turn societies into democracies. And that democratization process was all about introducing these institutions. Does it now have a parliament? Is it holding elections? Does it know how to do these things, etc.? And then we were quite complacent about having created democracy. This is the end of history argument. Now, the problem with that argument and that kind of vision of democracy is that we then don't have any explanation for what is happening at the moment. In 2025, if you look at all those established democracies, whether in Europe, North America, India, these are democracies that are in serious trouble. People living in these contexts are saying our freedoms, our experience of this democratic country has changed quite radically. Freedom of expression is not anymore as well guarded as it used to be. The separation of powers looks more increasingly doubtful, where if you think of the US, think of India, where judges seem to be pronouncing judgments that are politically colored, the free media is disappearing, and so on. We know this scenario. So what happened? If democracy is just a set of institutions you need to kind of install in context, and then it's going to flourish. Clearly, there's something wrong with thinking about democracy in those ways. And pushing back against that, what I tried to argue is that it's a dynamic process. It's just like you were saying, it takes toil. It's something you're trying to grow. You have to look after it. You have to work hard, be vigilant about any degeneration that is occurring in it. It is a process of continual cultivation. You have to preserve these democratic cultures that those institutions are meant to institutionalize. And so the opposite of cultivation then becomes complacency. And I think that's what we have seen the world over, that we thought we had democracy. We sat back and got on with our lives without paying enough attention to whether those very institutions and indeed the very societies that we were hoping would come out of such freedoms has been preserved. And so unless we do that hard work, patiently without looking for immediate rewards in a way that a farmer doesn't expect a plant to provide a harvest within 2 days of starting to cultivate, we need to generate some of that ethos in our thinking about democracy.
One of the things is that when we talk of the first thing we talk of when we talk of democracy is voting. So in a lot of places, if you have elections, if you hold elections routinely, if you hold elections when they're supposed to be held, and if they're somewhat free and fair, then you're regarded to be a democracy at the, sort of the lowest threshold of it, if you will. But somehow, even that is something that we can no longer take for granted around the world today. We are seeing, a decline in voter turnouts, less enthusiasm amongst young voters in many parts of the world. But this is something that has always surprised me and clearly, surprised and intrigued you. That in India, despite all the structural issues we have, despite the fact that, people at the onset of the republic didn't even think that we have an electorate that would take to democracy. Uh, we consistently have above average voter turnouts in most parts of the country. And this is something that you set out to study that resulted in the book, Why India Votes. This is something I hope to unpack in a later conversation with you, perhaps closer to some election. But uh, because we're talking about what happens between elections, I think it's important for us to address why India votes in such large numbers and what your finding has been in that regard.
If you think about a national election in India, the scale of it is so vast. It is now with growing populations, it's nearly 1 billion people going to the polls. I mean, it's extraordinary the number of people involved. And, India bucks the trend that many other countries, exactly like you were saying, they turnouts are falling. I mean, I live in Britain, persuading. I did a lot of canvassing during the national elections last year in 2024, and getting people to feel committed, that sense of responsibility that if you're a citizen with rights to vote, you should actually be exercising it. People worked hard for it to gain this right. That sense is quite dwindling in a lot of the older, mature democracies in the West. In India, the interesting thing is that not only are turnouts going up, but that if you're socially disadvantaged in any way, by gender, by caste, by class, by rurality, 70% of India is rural, um, where if you're marginal in any way, and which is most of India's population, you're more likely to vote than less. Right? And there, not to go, like we said, we can talk about this later in greater detail, but the critical thing to note here is that unlike all other conversations about elections, what I was interested in was what is motivating people to go and vote that is not just about making their candidate win. We think of elections as this instrumental act. I go and vote, so my party wins, or my candidate wins. But I think the most radical finding of my research and then the team of researchers I worked with to check this comparatively at a national level in India was that people like voting. they like to go to vote because of the experience of voting itself. And why is it so precious? Because the polling booth, the polling station in India, is unlike any other social space in India, without exception, where there is genuine social mixing. So the chances of multi-caste, multi-class, men and women, all kinds of professions, all kinds of people standing in the single line waiting to vote simply doesn't happen in any other context. And if you're socially disadvantaged or marginalized, to be in that kind of space, to be counted as equal to anyone else, that itself was very meaningful because it allowed you to glimpse very fleetingly what equality feels like, right? It was the only instance in people's lives in India where you felt that, yeah, I am really just a citizen of India as is the president of India. And people would say that, for this day, my vote is the same as the president of India. It's the same, exactly the same vote. And the second thing, which is worth mentioning here in brief, is that of all the public institutions in India, for a very long time, I'm sorry to say that is no longer the case, but the Election Commission of India was the most highly rated public institution because people felt, despite, like you were saying, that, so much doesn't work, but the Election Commission of India had a reputation for conducting genuinely free and fair elections. And people said that, this actually works in our country. Why wouldn't we participate? This works, it's free, it's on in my neighborhood. I must go and exercise my right. And it's actually an enjoyable moment because I feel valued. So these were the findings that we found. And like I said, that has radically changed in India today. And that's for another day, that conversation.
Mukulika, I will, as a journalist, I've been going out to cover elections for now almost 20 years. And one of the things that happens time and time again is that I live in Delhi, or, briefly, I've lived in Bombay. And when we're sitting in cities like Delhi and Bombay, we get used to armchair conversations where we are lamenting the state of the country. Either we're lamenting the state of public services, public goods, or, we're not happy with the political party in charge and what it stands for, and so on and so forth. And then when we set out and we go to villages and to smaller towns to just before elections, what is always struck by the sort of festivity that surrounds it. The way in which
Yeah,
canvassing happens, right? In a tiny little town, there'll be 700 posters and so many candidates and colorful candidates and independent candidates, and there will be up to some antic or the other, and there will be rallies going back and forth, and that whole town is going to transform for that one odd month before the election, and you're going to feel that sort of buzz that you feel during Holi or Eid or Diwali in these towns, and people are going to come out, uh, sometimes wearing their Sunday best to vote, and voting day is going to be chutti day. Your house help, etc., is going to be like, I'm not coming tomorrow, it's vote day. And that just completely shifts, at least for me, it just shifts the sort of heaviness with which we end up conducting a lot of conversations. That is not to say
absolutely.
that we don't have problems, we don't have serious concerns, but it kind of really fills me with joy and hope and excitement because it's so infectious. And to that end, often another conversation that comes up when we're frustrated with what's going on in the country, people will just reflexively blame the electorate and say, we don't know how to vote. We vote for all the wrong reasons. And I keep trying to argue that somehow, even though I can't really always support my argument, I keep trying to argue that Indians over the last 70, 75 years, every Indian has developed an inherent democratic instinct. Uh, and I think that this argument that I've been trying to make, often unsuccessfully, because I'm often in front of people who are so unhappy about something or the other. is so well addressed by your framing device of how Indians cultivate democracy on ground. And you used a wonderful example from Bengal in your lecture. And I was wondering if you could start with that and then kind of really try to unpack for us what happens between elections that sustains democracies.
So, one thing I always say, because I'm a social anthropologist by training, anthropology studies all aspects of society, right? So even if you're studying politics and elections and democracy, you're very aware that any voter who shows up at the polling station also has a whole life behind her. She may be a farmer, she might be quite a pious woman, she might have like to gossip, she might be, she might be known as the best cook in the village. I mean, there are all kinds of aspects to her life that are also part of her sensibility and subjectivity that is creating the desire to go and vote. And unless we see voters in the round, we are not going to understand how they behave during elections. So, political ideas, political opinions are being shaped by the economy, by kinship structures, by religion, and it's trying to capture that by saying, okay, what's happening in between elections that causes people to turn elections into carnivals, like you were describing so evocatively, that it is a carnival. So what are the processes? So the example I used was of, in the village, there was a very dominant comrade. This is during the left frontiers in West Bengal. And he was, at that small village level, he displayed all the characteristics that we now see in authoritarian leaders the world over, right? That he was ruthless, he was arrogant, self-obsessed, um, absolutely believed in no norms. He wanted his way or the highway. He was a microcosm of what we are seeing as the authoritarian turn in the world over. But watching it, and this is the advantage of doing field work at one small micro level, is that you develop some insight into how these things works, which you can then scale up later. And what I saw putting this under the magnifying glass was that the comrade was so vindictive and so venal that people were absolutely terrified to talk about politics because they felt that if they said the slightest thing in criticism, word would reach him and they would be literally stamped out. People were killed, and so on, cut down to size. In this kind of context, what do you do? He belongs to a party that's been winning elections for over 3 decades. There's entrenched power. Well, how do you behave democratically as citizens? What do you do with those rights that you have on paper? And so what I was describing was there was a small opening where he had overplayed his hand and caused a scandal, which had crossed a red line. And this time it wasn't a political red line because all political red lines had been crossed long ago. But he'd crossed a religious red line, a kinship red line. He had forced a marriage that would be considered absolutely haram or taboo by in any Muslim society. And that that was the point at which people said, that's it, enough. We have to do something. But they didn't know how to do anything because any um, mechanics of collaboration had been stamped out through, and that's what authoritarianism does. So people found ways of rekindling friendships, of reaching out and saying, okay, how can I win back this friendship by doing my erstwhile friend a favor that'll save his face at his son's wedding? Or neighbors decided that they were going to protect this. There was only one female headed household in the village and who were very vulnerable to the comrade's sexual appetite. And, this man was morally depraved. Um, they started dropping in and supporting these women when they were in most vulnerable. And very curiously, and this will be of interest, is that, often institutions too create this capacity for behaving democratically. So my third example was of a self-help group, which was ostensibly about, people say it's about financial empowerment. It is about creating capacity to be entrepreneurial and so on. But actually, the unintended consequence of the self-help group was that it created a new kind of collective of these women who really didn't know each other very well to start with, but because they had been joined together in this enterprise of the self-help group, a new forum emerged where women found ways of forming solidarity with people they didn't know very well, but they had a common purpose, and so they came together. And all these small mechanics of neighborliness, of friendship, of self-help group solidarity, all of these were slowly marshaled together. And they went behind this one young man who had the guts to take on the comrade and actually managed to overturn that comrade's decision of forcing this particular marriage. But this was, at this level, you can just say, oh, well, this is village politics, there's factions and people fight and then they come together and so on. But if you do long-term field work, as I've been doing for such a long time, and you see things developing year on year, in the Bengal context, for a very long time, between 1977 and 2011, the left front won every election. But from the early 2000s, when Trinamool Congress came up and Mamata Banerjee set up a new party to challenge the communists, there was no cadre-based network across the state, right? I mean, unlike the communists, but she needed that. She was based in Kolkata. And when word got out that there was a political party, a small fledgling political party, challenging the communist hegemony, it was in my research village, it was this little group that had formed to challenge the comrade that said, okay, we can form the local chapter of Trinamool Congress. And they were the ones who ultimately campaigned in the elections. And this just scaled up because what was happening was a similar process of alliance building in multiple villages, thousands of villages across West Bengal, that ultimately led to that Trinamool win in 2011, ousting the left front government. As someone, who's always doing research when an election happens, I remember conversations, in 2011, people say, oh, how did the communists lose? They were so entrenched. And at that macro level, you can't explain election results sometimes. You need to know what is going on the ground, what kind of disaffection exists. But not just disaffection is not enough. If you're fed up, it's not enough. You've got to do something about it. And this was an illustration of what do you do? How do you build alliances? How do you cooperate to create a political opposition, despite the worst conditions of authoritarianism? And it's a hopeful result in as much whatever your political leanings, you think, okay, you can actually use the mechanisms of elections and the institutional framework of democracy to change the political culture of a place. So that's the way in which I think we could and we should think about democracy as not something that happens at elections, but there are democratic sensibilities of challenging entrenched power, of asking questions, of requiring accountability, of not taking for granted your rights to vote and actually instrumentalizing that power to effect change.
No, it makes complete sense. And I think this is just such a great example to illustrate what you call democratic sensibility, what I was calling democratic instinct or reflex, if you
Yes.
will, which I have found exists slightly outside often the frameworks within which we tend to study and evaluate democracies, right? And one of the examples that you brought up was self-help groups. And it's very interesting as you know, Mukulika, I've also been at the LSE. And when I was at the LSE in 2015, you remember this moment when had just passed when self-help groups were all the rage. Muhammad Yunus had won, big
That's right.
prizes for his push of self-help groups. microfinance in particular. And come 2015, 2016, there was some disaffection because
That's
there
right.
were some very, very credible papers showing that, in fact, in the long run, it is not pulling families and women out of poverty. And in this moment in 2016, I was with a team and we went to Uttar Pradesh and we were going to be studying. These studies were coming out of mostly south of India, and then they wanted to kind of look at it in the north of India, and I was there to help set up the study. And there were many confounding variables because India, in many parts, also had a very robust welfare state until then. So Manrega was operational in the right to work, right to food, etc. So while we were setting up this study, I started to get to know the women who had been part of these sort of microfinance groups for now over a decade. And what I found was that while it was likely that the study that was being set up will end up finding that microfinance might not be what it has been made out to be in terms of poverty alleviation, in ways that perhaps econometrics cannot, within its discipline study, it had still been transformative for these villages, if only by allowing women from different castes to be able to sit down and mingle and speak with one another
Exactly.
once a week or once in 2 weeks. And the results were astounding to me, but they forget about finding a framework to study them. These women were not even really willing to share these stories outside. This happened to be a few villages around my native village in UP. So because I spoke their native tongue, they were still more forthcoming. And in that moment, I remember feeling that I don't know if we'll truly ever understand the nature of how democracy works in this country. But I wanted to
Can
ask
I-
you to give this a stab anyway, and talk a little bit about, if we stick with the cultivation metaphor, what irrigates the soil outside of institutions, which we already, acknowledged are the sort of broad pillars of a democracy. What irrigates the soil?
This is so interesting, Pragya, your fieldwork in UP amongst these women, and it completely corroborates what my findings were. And I wrote a paper exactly about this, addressing what the critique has been of self-help groups and the financialized poverty landscape, kind of um, a neoliberal conspiracy to force people into being productive and take charge of their own prosperity rather and a retreat of the state rather than providing welfare. You expect people to create their own welfare and get themselves out of poverty. And I took this critique head on. And through the kind of observations that you just made about these women and that I saw with these women in the self-help group in the village, the key thing here is that if you're measuring only for economic benefit or has this family come out of poverty, the results might well indeed be very, very mixed. But like I said, there is an unintended consequence, which I call civic growth. We keep measuring economic growth as a sign of a healthy economy, country. How do we measure the health of a democracy? And I would argue, why don't we have a category of civic growth, which is precisely this capacity to organize, to build solidarity, to ask questions, to empower, to genuinely feel, this is drawing on Amartya Sen's ideas of the capability approach. Do people have the conditions in which they can realize their potential to be politically democratic, behave in democratic fashions? And self help groups unexpectedly created that capacity for civic growth. So, here the key thing is being able to work with people who you don't know, are not particularly friends with, but you come together to create a common project. And that's why in the lecture I was drawing on this, on Robert Putnam's very well-known book, Bowling Alone, where he makes this key point, which links to what you and I are saying about self-help groups, which is that it is the presence of what he calls bridging groups. So these are bridging groups, these self-help groups, because these are multi-caste, multi-age, multi-generational groups. These are not people who would normally have come together. So this is not hanging out with your friends at a dinner party. This is not going to the village fair with your family. Those are bonding groups because those are people you already share something with. But when you're able to create bridges with people you might not otherwise be in concert with in any common action, then you're creating the capacity to behave democratically. And that's why when people are increasingly atomized in their existence, this is a real problem for democracy. So this is why he says, people earlier used to bowl, they used to go bowling in bowling alleys, but they didn't just go and bowl as they do now. Earlier, they used to be part of leagues. So, bunches of people got together who didn't otherwise know each other, but they bowled as part of leagues. You can still now go and bowl, but now people are bowling alone. And that is when we talk about a fractured media landscape, the fact that people know less and less people who are not like them, that there is no, when we say civil society is important, what are we saying? That, why is civil society so important to democracy? We are saying that we need a layer of society between family, which is kin, people related, and the nation, where there is another layer of association where people are coming together through shared projects, whether it is running a local library or doing a cleanup campaign, or, there are hundreds of different activities that happen at that civil society level where you are creating that capacity for behaving in a democratic fashion, and generating civic growth, without which you are never going to get the kind of ability to fight to preserve democracy when things go wrong. So in the current global moment, when things are so bad on the democratic front everywhere, um, we need to be measuring the health of civic growth in countries to see if they will survive it or not.
Mukulika, you extend this framework of cultivating democracy that you developed while doing your field work in rural India to universities in your lecture. And you talk about the importance of universities as crucibles of democratic thought, ethos, and action. You are in one of the world's leading universities. It's the kind of university that other universities could look up to. In your experience, is the space for the potential of universities in cultivating democratic ethos shrinking? And if so, why? What can be done about it?
So universities, often talking about cultivation as we have been doing and saying it's a metaphor that comes out of farming and so on, is not to say that it can only be done in rural areas or in farms. And besides, in India, that these are small land holdings. Cultivation looks very different to, say, in the US or in Europe. Um, so farming just tells you something about how individual and exhausting the work is. That's what I'm trying to get out. And to say that this is not confined, obviously, to farming and the rural, it can happen anywhere, in any context. In the urban context, universities are actually, like you say, an ideal site of such cultivation. And that's why I called my lecture Citizens as Cultivars, because I was saying that democratic citizens are like cultivars. They're plants that are created for certain good characteristics. And the a cultivar is something that will retain those characteristics when they're propagated in the future. And my argument was really that universities are precisely such crucibles for cultivating cultivars. We are creating democratic citizens in these spaces so that when students leave the university and go out into the world to do whatever they do, whichever profession, they carry some of that sensibility with them. Now, your question really is, are these spaces still present? I think we're very lucky in the UK that we are in a landscape of higher education where we can still fight and preserve some things. In the US, things are at the moment, every day one is getting uh, messages and emails from friends in US universities who are already being told to shut down the teaching of not just radical political ideas, but things that we had felt was essential to any half decent education, where you would talk about race or talk about gender or talk about the inequalities in the world. Words like this have now become taboo on the higher education landscape. So there is a real present threat at this moment in many parts of the world. In India, academic freedom has been um, uh, severely diminished, I would say, in the last few years. So these are very threatened landscapes. And looking, therefore, both to India and the USA as examples, in the UK, I think we still have enough freedoms to continue to not just continue, but do something actually quite new to radically try and preserve the ethos of a university. But the challenges are that there have been some structural changes that have brought in. Higher education in the UK used to be um, funded very differently. It used to be designed very differently, but that has changed because what is a big radical change was when students had to start paying tuition fees. So any state help of higher education investment was taken away. So universities were left basically to generate their own uh, funds. And this meant speculative investments, this meant financialization of assets, this meant relying on student fees to keep your nose above the water, etc. And all of that, people have written about that very eloquently. We can provide a couple of pieces in our show notes. But the end of that process, the outcome, is that particular ethos in which faculty and students are co-creating knowledge rather than delivering knowledge to customers, that shift has now happened. If you begin to think about students as customers who are paying a big price and you have to package this education and give it to them, then you're just skilling them for jobs. You're not really giving them a rounded education, right? But so those are the constraints within which we're already working. And I was arguing and making a very strong case that we should, despite those structural constraints, try and retain some of the ethos of citizenship on campuses, which means that we have to preserve spaces inside, but also very crucially outside the classroom, where students can continue to create the capacity for civic growth. So, and that is, are they forming bridging groups? Are they being able to meet people from other disciplines? Are they meeting people from other countries, other class? And it is the only time in their lives, I would say, in any of our lives when we go to university, is our worlds open up, because from going from a relatively sheltered existence, we are meeting people and having experience that we've never had before. And this is formative and it shapes your sensibility for the rest of your days. And I was making a case that these spaces, what are these spaces? Where are students forming bridging groups? Um, to recognize them for what they are and to recognize their capacity for creating those democratic values. On this, one thing which I didn't say, Pragya, in the lecture, but maybe this is a good moment to just it's a piece that I might actually write up quite soon, so listeners can have a quick preview of it here. Is that one really urgent concern on UK campuses? UK is what I know best, so I'll talk about that. But I think this is a problem worldwide. Is something that the two university leaders who were at my lecture later sent me long messages responding to my lecture. And I completely agree with the sentiment of what they were saying, which is that the huge polarization that is occurring in society, where people who disagree just can't seem to um, have a conversation anymore, is also happening on campuses. And here, my thinking on this at the moment is that students should be students, like I was describing. It's their chance to explore, to experiment, to discover the world. The faculty, on the other hand, I think, for a long time, we've been fairly complacent, is the word, about using the university and seeing the campus as as a stage for playing out our politics as well. And I am changing my position on this. I think as faculty, we probably have a very distinct role to play, which is not seeing the university campus as a place where we stage our own politics, but actually see our role as conveners of platforms where conversations are possible, right? Where we teach and learn ourselves to disagree well. This is a Tagore term. How do you disagree well? And how we can create those. And that's a very difficult thing because it is a bit of a course correction that is required, I think, to deal with this very urgent problem of polarization on campuses.
No, I absolutely agree. I wouldn't call it course correction. I would call it responding to a crisis that has, sort of taken over our lives in very unexpected ways and very rapidly. And I think that's a marvelous idea. I was at the LSE. I don't think outside of you, I interacted with anybody who was not part of the School of Government or School of Economics. I don't think and we had mixers every evening. We were going out every evening. We were really involved in a million things that we were doing around the ambit of what we were studying. But I don't think I met anybody, even from the Department of Law, uh,
Gosh.
within the university confines, and that is where the roles of platforms like the one you were running, LSE South Asia, for a while, that I was also involved with at that point in time, those kinds of platforms that can bring people from different disciplines and different points of view together become so important. But Mukul, before I wrap this up, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, and I think this would be a good end point to discussing the wonderful lecture you delivered, is that, usually when we study democracy, we think of it from the lens of governance, like I mentioned in the beginning, of policy, of economics, maybe even. But you deploy the tools of an anthropologist to try and unpack what the past and future of democracy can look like. I'm wondering what you think it allows you to address in terms of questions that have not gotten enough attention, and in what way can an anthropologist's study of democracy add to the very, very important work that has happened and needs to happen on democracies?
So I think the first thing to say on that, building on what we've been saying today, is society and what makes society work is something that anthropology understands very well. Economists have recently discovered social capital. I'm very pleased for economists. Now that economists have discovered it, hopefully this will become more um, legitimate in the eyes of government and policymakers. But one thing that any anthropologist will tell you is that Of course, there is conflict in society. Where there is human society, there will be conflict, there will be politics, there will be divisions. But what we also know, because we live and work in local languages and become part of the fabric of a society when we do research, we are not just, anthropology does not go in with clipboards of questions. We learn languages and we just immerse ourselves in that society. We become participant observers. Our PhD students in the LSE Department of Anthropology do field work for 18 months in a place. And why is it 18 months? Because we understand that things occur once a year in cycles, and the life of any community cannot be understood unless you've sat through a whole calendar year of cycles, whether it is the agricultural year or the religious year. You've got to have witnessed everything at least once, and then you stay on a bit longer beyond the 12 months, because the first time it happens, you don't realize how significant it is. So you have to observe it again to see it in context. Now, this kind of immersion in a society, which anthropology uniquely does, is also tells you, it also shows you how community is created despite divisions. And I think this is key, So, yes, there is factionalism. Yes, there is violence. In the Indian case, the study of Indian society is so dominated, as it should be, by studies of caste, of class, of discrimination, of violence against um, minorities, all kinds of violences that happen in a society. And yet, the puzzle really is how do communities hold together? How do communities remain communities? And for that, you need to understand, as we try and do, the cross-cutting ties. What are the bases on which you can build those bridges? How do you deploy kinship and friendship and neighborliness and religious affiliation to bring people together? And unless you find and understand mechanisms that bring people together, you're not going to understand how you can create solidarities and togetherness. This has always been anthropology's enterprise amongst many others. In the context today, when we talk about polarized communities, in the context in which we're saying that democracy is backsliding, institutions are crumbling in real time, how do we create that capacity to fight back, to care, to protect, to come together, to work together to protect them? None of this can be done at an individual level. Anthropology shows us, I think, through countless examples, how in the face of adversity, people are able to work together. And that, I think, is, something that anthropology very uniquely brings, because we see people in the ground and understand where anxieties are produced, what people will care for, and how they will protect them. And we've got to bring that understanding into these contemporary conversations. And as a political anthropologist, that's entirely my effort at the moment, whether it is fighting to preserve democratic cultures or whether it is to preserve universities and their unique ethos.
Well, I, for one, hope you continue to study democracies for a very long time. Your conversations with me, the work you've been doing, I find it greatly enriching to my own practice, to my own work. I have just gone back to the field, and I find myself having conversations with you in my head oftentimes. And in my head and online, these conversations will continue. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the India Briefing, and we will see you very soon with another episode.
Thank you.